Long before the Bible was written, the desert thundered with war, not between kings, but between gods. Yahweh, the stormbringer of Israel, stood alone against the mighty Baal, the fierce Chemosh, and the ancient Marduk. This was not just religion. This was a war for the throne of the universe. For thousands of years, people have told the story of Yahweh, the God who claimed absolute rule over the nations. But in the ancient Near East, such a claim was an act of war. Every tribe had its god, every empire its divine protector. And to say Yahweh alone was to declare open rebellion against the spiritual order of the world. Today, we journey deep into the battlefields of myth and history to uncover the real story of how Yahweh challenged and defeated the gods of the nations. In the ancient Near East, religion was never a purely private matter. It was a battlefield. Every city, every tribe, every empire had its own gods, and those gods were believed to shape the fate of nations. Victory in war wasn't just about armies and weapons. It was proof that your God was stronger than theirs. In this world, Yahweh, the God of Israel, stood against a crowded pantheon: Baal the stormbringer, Molech the fire devourer, Chemosh the warrior of Moab, and the mighty El and Asherah of Canaan. The Hebrew Bible is filled with echoes of this cosmic rivalry. In the Exodus story, the plagues of Egypt are not random disasters. They're targeted strikes against the gods of Egypt. The Nile turned to blood challenges Hapi, the frog plague mocks Heket, and the sun's darkness shames Ra himself. In these narratives, Yahweh is not one god among many. He is the God who humiliates all rivals. This divine competition was not always abstract. Ancient inscriptions, treaties, and victory monuments from surrounding nations often credit their gods with granting them triumph over Israel. The Mesha stele, for example, boasts that Chemosh, god of Moab, defeated Yahweh's people. In return, the biblical writers answer with their own vision. Yahweh is not bound by borders. He is the Lord of heaven and earth, whose power extends far beyond Israel's territory. In the time of the kings, the confrontation between Yahweh and Baal became the central stage of this divine drama. The most famous clash happened on Mount Carmel, when the prophet Elijah challenged 450 prophets of Baal to call down fire from heaven. All day they cried to Baal, nothing happened. Then Elijah prayed, and fire from Yahweh consumed the sacrifice, the altar, even the water around it. In the eyes of the people, the verdict was clear. Yahweh, He is God. These battles between gods were more than theological debates. They were about identity, survival, and destiny. For Israel, worshiping Yahweh alone was both a spiritual and political act, setting them apart from the nations and their deities. Every victory or defeat on the battlefield was a question of divine supremacy, and for the biblical writers, the answer was never in doubt. Yahweh was the true king, and the so-called gods of the nations were powerless pretenders. The war between Yahweh and the gods of the nations was not fought in a single generation, nor was it merely the memory of a few dramatic contests. It was a centuries-long struggle of ideas, loyalties, and identities, played out in the hills of Canaan, in the courts of kings, and in the hearts of a people constantly tempted to follow the ways of their neighbors. In the earliest days of Israel's history, Yahweh was proclaimed as the God who had brought His people out of Egypt. defeating the power of Pharaoh, and, by implication, the gods of Egypt themselves. This Exodus memory was more than a historical event, it was a theological manifesto. The plagues were remembered not as random disasters, but as calculated humiliations of Egypt's divine guardians, each playing a direct insult to a specific god. The Nile turned to blood mocked the river god Hapi. The plague of frogs ridiculed Hecate, the frog-headed goddess of fertility. The darkness that fell over the land challenged Ra, the sun god himself. In this telling, Yahweh's victory was not over men alone, but over the very spiritual powers that sustained Egypt's empire. Yet the journey into Canaan would bring new challenges. The land was filled with the worship of Baal, Asherah, Molech, and Chemosh gods with deep roots in the cultural and agricultural rhythms of the region. Baal was the storm god, the bringer of rain, essential for crops in a land dependent on seasonal showers. His worship was tied to fertility rites and sacred groves, offering tangible promises of prosperity. Asherah, often depicted as Baal's consort or as the mother goddess, symbolized life and fertility. Her worship involving wooden poles or carved idols planted near altars. Molech, infamous in biblical condemnation, demanded child sacrifice, a practice seen by some ancient peoples as the ultimate gift to secure a god's favor. Chemosh, the god of Moab, was venerated as a warrior deity, leading his people into battle and granting them victory. Israel's covenant with Yahweh demanded absolute loyalty, but in a world where divine power was thought to be localized, one god for each land, a temptation to hedge one's bets was strong. After all, if Baal sent the rain, why not honor him during planting season? If Asherah protected households, why not keep a carved image in the corner of the home? This syncretism, blending Yahweh worship with the worship of other gods, became one of the central struggles in Israel's story. The prophets thundered against it, portraying the mixing of loyalties as spiritual adultery. Hosea, for instance, used the metaphor of an unfaithful wife to describe Israel's flirtations with Baal, warning that the blessings they attributed to other gods had always come from Yahweh alone. The biblical writers did not shy away from portraying this struggle as a direct contest between Yahweh and the rival deities. One of the most vivid accounts comes from the reign of King Ahab, when the prophet Elijah challenged 450 prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. The contest was simple. Whichever god answered by fire would be acknowledged as the true god. All day, Baal's prophets shouted, danced, and cut themselves, but no fire fell. Elijah, mocking them, suggested Baal might be asleep or traveling. When Yahweh's turn came, Elijah drenched the altar with water, making the task seemingly impossible. His prayer was brief, but the response was immediate. Fire fell from heaven, consuming not only the sacrifice, but the stones and water as well. The people, stunned, fell to their knees, crying, "Yahweh, He is God." This was not just a miracle story. It was propaganda in the best sense, a public demonstration meant to shatter Baal's credibility. Beyond such dramatic showdowns, the war of the deities was also waged in the quieter realm of poetry and liturgy. The songs often portray Yahweh as a warrior who crushes the nations and their gods. Psalm 29, for instance, takes language commonly used for bold a voice over the waters. The God of the storm, and applies it entirely to Yahweh. The message was clear. The powers you attribute to bold belong to Israel's God. Other psalms mock the idols of the nations as lifeless statues, made of wood and stone, with mouths that cannot speak and eyes that cannot see. These poetic taunts served to strip the rival gods of legitimacy in the minds of the faithful. However, the reality on the ground was often more complicated. Archaeology has uncovered inscriptions from ancient Israelite sites invoking Yahweh and his Asherah, suggesting that for many, Yahweh was worshipped alongside a consort. This folk religion existed in tension with the official theology of the Jerusalem temple, which increasingly insisted on Yahweh's uniqueness. In times of crisis, especially military defeat, some Israelites may have questioned Yahweh's power compared to that of the nation's gods. The Moabite king Mesha famously recorded on the Mesha stele that his god Chemosh had delivered Moab from Israel's domination, a claim that directly contradicted Israel's belief in Yahweh's supremacy. From the Moabite perspective, the war of the deities was re-land Chemosh had won around. It was the prophets, particularly in the period leading up to and following the Babylonian exile, who reframed the entire conflict. Figures like Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel began to declare not just that Yahweh was stronger than the other gods, but that the other gods were nothing at all, mere human inventions. In this radical shift, the divine battlefield was closed forever. There were no rival gods to fight, only idols and delusions. Yahweh was not simply the God of Israel. He was the creator of heaven and earth, the only true God. The war of the deities ended not with a negotiated peace, but with a declaration of monotheistic victory. There were no other deities left to oppose. This theological evolution had profound political and cultural effects. In the ancient worldview, gods were tied to their people's defeat in battle, often meant abandoning your God for the victor's deity. But Israel's prophets turned this logic on its head. The exile to Babylon, rather than being proof of Yahweh's weakness, was proclaimed as his judgment on his own people for their unfaithfulness. Babylon's gods had not defeated Yahweh. Yahweh had allowed Babylon to triumph as part of his sovereign plan. This reimagining of history preserved faith in Yahweh even in the face of national catastrophe, and it rendered the old divine rivalries irrelevant. Still, the memory of the war of the deities lingered in the scriptures, shaping the way later generations understood spiritual conflict. The New Testament writers would inherit this imagery, speaking of Christ's victory over principalities and powers, cosmic forces that echo the ancient gods of the nations. In Christian theology, the old rival deities became symbols of demonic opposition, forces already defeated through the cross. In Jewish thought, the emphasis remained on the absolute uniqueness of the God of Israel, a belief forged in centuries of contest and solidified in exile. In the end, the story of Yahweh versus the gods of the nations is not just about ancient religion, it is about the transformation of belief itself. It begins in a polytheistic world where gods are many and power is contested, and it ends in a monotheistic vision where all power belongs to one God alone. Along the way, it passes through battlefield victories, prophetic showdowns, poetic mockery, and deep theological reflection. It reveals a God who will not share his glory, a people cold to exclusive loyalty, and a religious imagination that could take the language of war and turn it into the language of universal sovereignty. In the ancient Near East, the outcome of a war between gods could never be final until Yahweh declared it was. By the late Second Temple period, the old rivalries between Yahweh and the gods of the nations had largely disappeared from mainstream Jewish worship, at least in their earlier, mythic form. The belief in Yahweh's absolute uniqueness had become foundational, embedded in the Shema. Hear, O Israel, Yahweh is our God, Yahweh alone. Yet the imagery of a cosmic struggle remained alive only now. The enemy was no longer Cold Bor, Chemosh, or Melech. Instead, these figures had been recast as spiritual powers, malign forces working behind the nations and their kings, seeking to oppose the purposes of Israel's God. In Jewish apocalyptic literature, these powers often appear as angels or spirits assigned to different nations, a theological framework that preserved the old gods of the nations concept while reinterpreting it in a monotheistic key. The Book of Daniel, written during the Hellenistic period, is a prime example of this transformation. In Daniel 10, the prophet describes an angelic messenger who is delayed for 21 days because of a conflict with the prince of Persia, a spiritual being representing the Persian Empire. Later, the prince of Greece is mentioned as the next opponent in the unfolding of history. Here, the old divine rivals are no longer independent gods, they are spiritual princes, subordinate to the Most High but still engaged in opposition. The imagery preserves the ancient worldview in which every nation had its own divine or spiritual patron, but firmly asserts that Yahweh commands the ultimate authority over them all. The war of the deities has moved from the mountaintops and battlefields of Canaan to the unseen realms of angelic and demonic conflict. The Dead Sea Scrolls community, often identified with the Essenes, took this cosmic battle imagery even further. Their writings are filled with the language of light and darkness, the sons of light against the sons of darkness, led respectively by the archangel Michael and the mysterious figure Belial, a name used for the ultimate enemy of God's people. For them, the war was both spiritual and historical. Foreign oppressors like Rome were merely the earthly instruments of a deeper, cosmic adversary. In their worldview, every political conflict was also a theological one, a skirmish in the grand war between Yahweh and the spiritual forces behind the nations. This apocalyptic reframing was not simply a theological curiosity, it was a survival strategy. In the ancient world, military defeat was often interpreted as proof that the defeated nation's God had been overpowered by the victor's deity, but by interpreting foreign domination as the work of rebellious spiritual powers temporarily allowed to act by Yahweh's permission, Jewish thinkers preserved their belief in Yahweh's sovereignty. Even Rome's mighty legions could be seen as pawns in a larger cosmic drama, whose outcome had already been determined. The war of the deities had been reimagined, but the confidence in Yahweh's ultimate triumph remained unchanged. When Christianity emerged from this Jewish matrix, it inherited this same framework, but reshaped it around the person of Jesus. In the Gospels, Jesus confronts not the idols of stone and wood, but the demons' personal spiritual beings, understood to be the real powers behind sickness, oppression, and false worship. His exorcisms were not mere healings, but acts of war, each one a victory over the forces that had long held humanity captive. In this way, the war of the deities became the war of the kingdom of God against the dominion of Satan. The gospel writers present Jesus as the stronger one who binds the strong man and plunders his house, a direct echo of the old theme of Yahweh humiliating the gods of the nations. Paul the Apostle would take this idea and express it in explicitly cosmic terms. In his letters, he speaks of principalities, powers, rulers of this present darkness, and spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. These terms are best understood as referring to the same kinds of beings the book of Daniel called the princes of the nation's spiritual rulers, who stand behind human empires. For Paul, the death and resurrection of Jesus were the decisive victory in this cosmic war. In Colossians 2:15, he writes that God, through the cross, disarmed the powers and authorities, making a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them in it. The language here deliberately recalls the imagery of ancient kings parading conquered enemies through the streets. Only now the enemies are the spiritual powers once thought of as gods. The book of Revelation provides the most vivid Christian adaptation of the old war of the gods imagery. Here, Rome is portrayed as Babylon, a city in league with the dragon Satan and his beasts, symbolic representations of political and religious powers. The dragon's war in heaven, his defeat by Michael and his angels, and his final destruction in the lake of fire, all echo the older stories of Yahweh's victories over rival gods, now revealed as the final phase of a cosmic battle stretching from the dawn of creation to the end of time. The idols of the nations have disappeared from the stage, but the spiritual forces they represented are alive in the imagery, destined for the same ultimate fate, defeat and annihilation. What is striking across this long arc of development is the consistency of the underlying conviction. There is only one true God, and he will ultimately triumph over every rival, whether those rivals are conceived as other gods, national spirits, demons, or cosmic forces. The old names Baal, Chemosh, Molech fade into history, but their roles in the drama are filled by new actors. The battle changes in form, but not in meaning. The prophet's denunciations of idolatry, the psalmist's taunts against false gods, the apocalyptic visions of angelic warfare, and the Christian proclamation of Christ's victory are all chapters in the same story. In modern scholarship, some have sought to demythologize this story, interpreting the war of the deities purely as a symbolic way of describing political and cultural struggles. Others have emphasized the sociological function of these beliefs, noting how they helped small, vulnerable communities maintain their identity and hope in the face of larger and more powerful empires. Yet even if one strips away the supernatural elements, the pattern remains compelling, a narrative in which loyalty to one God stands in opposition to every competing claim, whether political, religious, or spiritual. The ancient Israelites told it in the language of fire from heaven. The Essenes told it in the language of light and darkness. The Christians told it in the language of cross and resurrection. Each retelling renewed the conviction that the God of Israel would not and could not be defeated. By the time Judaism and Christianity had firmly embraced their monotheistic identities, the old pantheon of the ancient Near East was little more than a memory, preserved in scripture and archaeology, but the war of the deities had left a deep imprint on their religious imagination. The god who had once been portrayed as a warrior defeating Egypt's gods at the Red Sea, or consuming Baal's altar on Mount Carmel, was now understood as the eternal ruler who would one day banish every evil power from his creation. The conflict was no longer local. It was universal. The stakes were not the fate of one nation's crops or armies, but the destiny of the entire world. And so the ancient war of Yahweh versus the gods of the nations did not truly end, it expanded. It became the war for the hearts and minds of humanity, a war in which every act of faithfulness was a victory and every compromise a defeat. The old gods may be gone, their temples ruins, their names footnotes in history books, but the challenge they represented, the temptation to trust something other than the one true God, remains as present as ever. The biblical story insists that the outcome is certain, but it also insists that the battle is not yet over. The God who triumphed over the gods of Egypt and Canaan is still at war with every false power that claims authority over his creation and his people, whether ancient Israelite prophets, desert sectarians, or modern believers, are called to stand on his side in the ongoing war of the deities. By the close of the biblical era, the overt names and personalities of Yahweh's rivals had faded into the background, yet the structure of the ancient war of the gods worldview endured. As Judaism entered the rabbinic period, the struggle was reinterpreted not through public confrontations with pagan idols, but through the private, daily battle against Avodah worship in all its forms. The rabbis of the Mishnah and Talmud taught that, although the physical gods of the nations had been discredited, the impulse toward idolatry called the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, was still alive. They even developed a tradition that, after the destruction of the first temple, the great men of Israel prayed for God to remove the raw, supernatural power of idolatry from the world. According to the story, God granted their request, but the desire simply transformed, finding new outlets in greed, lust, and pride. In this telling, the war of the deities had shifted from the public arena of altars and sacrifices to the inner arena of the human heart. In the mystical traditions that began to take shape in late antiquity, the old cosmic struggle gained new, intricate dimensions. Early forms of Jewish mysticism, such as those found in the Hekalit and Merkava literature, portrayed the heavenly throne room as a site of ongoing conflict. Angelic hierarchies guarded the divine presence, while malevolent spiritual forces sought to intrude. These texts preserved the apocalyptic vision of warring powers, but placed them firmly in a structured, celestial bureaucracy, one in which Yahweh's authority was absolute, yet constantly challenged by rebellious spiritual beings. The Kabbalistic tradition, emerging fully in medieval Spain and Provence, expanded this into a complex cosmology. The Sephra terminations of the divine were opposed by the Qliphoth, shells of impurity and chaos, a mystical echo of the old rival gods who had once been Yahweh's foes. To the Kabbalists, Every human act of holiness strengthened the side of divine light, while every sin nourished the forces of darkness. In this way, the War of the Deities was not just ancient history. It was an ever-present spiritual reality in which every person participated. Meanwhile, Christianity carried its version of the cosmic battle into the medieval world, framing history itself as the arena of God's war against the devil and his powers. The Church Fathers of the patristic period drew heavily on biblical imagery, identifying pagan gods as demons in disguise, a direct continuation of the biblical and Second Temple idea that behind every idol lurked a hostile spiritual force. Augustine of Hippo, in The City of God, described all of human history as a conflict between two cities: the city of God, made up of those who love God, and the city of man, made up of those who love themselves. This mirrored the old Israelite conviction that there could be no neutral ground. Every human society was aligned with one side or the other in the cosmic war. In the medieval imagination, the War of the Deities was also made tangible in the lives of the saints, who were believed to battle demons in deserts, monasteries, and marketplaces. Hagiographies recount these spiritual contests. In dramatic terms, visions of the devil in monstrous forms, temptations resisted through prayer and fasting, miracles that shattered the hold of pagan practices in newly converted regions. The old image of Yahweh humiliating the gods of Egypt or Canaan was reborn in stories of Christian missionaries toppling idols in the forests of Germany, the islands of the North Sea, or the villages of Africa and Asia. For believers, these were not simply acts of religious reform. They were decisive blows in the ancient war, the ongoing campaign of the one true God against every false power. By the Reformation era, the polemical force of this ancient war imagery was turned inward as much as outward. Protestant reformers accused the Catholic Church of having reintroduced idolatry through the veneration of saints, relics, and the papacy itself, while Catholic apologists accused Protestants of dismantling the true order of God's Church and promoting heresy. In each case, the rhetorical weaponry came straight from the old arsenal. The other side was accused of siding, consciously or not, with the forces opposed to the living God. The language of the War of the Deities proved adaptable, capable of being wielded in almost any theological conflict. In the modern era, the explicit belief in rival gods has diminished in many quarters, yet the pattern of thought remains alive. In evangelical Christianity, particularly within Pentecostal and charismatic movements, the idea of spiritual warfare is essentially a direct descendant of the biblical and early Christian understanding of a cosmic battle. Here, the gods of the nations are often reframed as territorial spirits, demonic rulers over regions or cultures, whose influence must be broken through prayer, fasting, and proclamation of the gospel. This is remarkably close to the worldview of Daniel or Paul, even if the names of the enemies have changed. In political theology, too, the War of the Deities motif surfaces in subtler forms. Thinkers like Jacques Ellul and Walter Wink have spoken of the powers, the structures, institutions, and ideologies that claim ultimate loyalty and thereby function as false gods. Wink in particular drew from biblical language to argue that every human system has both an outward, visible form and an inward, spiritual reality. When those systems become unjust, their spiritual reality aligns with the powers of darkness. In this way, nationalism, consumerism, and totalitarianism can all be understood as modern expressions of the ancient gods of the nation's forces demanding worship and obedience in competition with the God of the Bible. Even in secular culture, the narrative of a lone, righteous power struggling against a corrupt and oppressive pantheon of rivals continues to resonate. Science fiction and fantasy frequently borrow directly from ancient Near Eastern motifs. A chosen people, a godlike ruler, a cosmic war whose outcome determines the fate of the world. These modern myths may strip away explicit religious language, but they preserve the archetype of single supreme good facing down a coalition of lesser but dangerous powers. In this sense, the War of the Deities is not merely a relic of ancient theology. It is a template for how human beings imagine conflict at its most absolute. In Judaism, the old themes continue as well, though often in transformed or allegorical ways. The annual retelling of the Exodus story at Passover is not just a remembrance of liberation from Egypt. It is a celebration of Yahweh's victory over the gods of Egypt, a reminder that every age has its pharaohs and its idols. The high holidays frame repentance as a return to the sovereignty of God, a rejection of every false claim to authority. In these liturgical rhythms, the ancient war is remembered, reenacted, and reapplied to the challenges of the present. Ultimately, the war of Yahweh against the gods of the nations is a story about exclusivity and allegiance. In the ancient Near East, the claim that one God had absolute authority over all others was revolutionary. It redefined religion from a matter of negotiating with many powers to a matter of loyalty to one. Over centuries, as the rivals were reimagined from literal gods to spiritual forces, demons, corrupt institutions, or cultural idols, the essential demand remained the same: choose your side. There is no neutral ground. The persistence of this theme across millennia suggests that it answers a deep human need. It provides a way of interpreting the world in moral and spiritual terms, of understanding suffering and oppression not as meaningless chaos, but as part of a larger story in which good ultimately triumphs. It also carries an implicit challenge. If there is a war between the one true God and all rival powers, then every action, every allegiance, every compromise matters. The war of the deities is not just fought on the stage of history. It is fought in every human life. And so the story comes full circle, from the high places of Canaan, where Yahweh was one God among many, to the prophetic declarations that He alone is God, to the apocalyptic visions of His cosmic victory. The war has been told and retold in countless forms. Today, the names of Bor, Chemosh, and Melech may be forgotten by all but historians, but their roles have been inherited by new powers, new idols, new false allegiances. The battlefield has shifted, but the stakes have not. The claim that began in the deserts of the ancient Near East still rings out. Yahweh is God, and there is no other. All other powers, whether divine, spiritual, or human, will, in the end, bow or be broken. By the time the biblical narrative gives way to history as we can trace it through archaeology and external records, the open, face-to-face battles between Yahweh and the gods of the nations had largely ceased. Timbrels to Baal were rubble, Asherah poles had been cut down, and the worship of Chemosh, Dagon, and Marduk had either been absorbed into other cults or disappeared entirely. Yet in the biblical worldview, this did not mean the war was over. If anything, the disappearance of named rivals only transformed the battleground. The enemies of Yahweh were no longer just statues in sanctuaries or rituals on high places. They were ideas, allegiances, and unseen powers woven into the fabric of human life. The ancient war of the deities had gone underground. One of the clearest continuities between the ancient and later expressions of this cosmic struggle is the conviction that behind human politics, wars, and cultural trends, there lies an invisible layer of spiritual conflict. In the prophetic imagination, national gods were not just symbols, but actual spiritual beings with agents, princes of Persia and Greece in Daniel, hosts of heaven in Kings, spiritual powers in the Psalms. The early Jews of the Second Temple period refined this view into a complex angelology and demonology, seeing the nations as still under the influence of rebellious spiritual rulers. This idea carried directly into early Christianity, where Paul spoke of principalities and powers, and the God of this age who blinds minds. The war of the deities, once fought in Canaan's valleys and on its mountaintops, was now fought in the arena of the unseen. In Christian interpretation, the climactic moment of this hidden war came in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. The Gospels present his ministry not only as a series of healings and teachings, but as a direct assault on the rule of the enemy, casting out demons, breaking the power of fear, confronting Satan in the wilderness. The cross itself was portrayed by early Christian thinkers as a paradoxical victory, a moment when the apparent defeat of God's anointed was actually the disarming of the rulers and authorities opposed to him. In this view, the resurrection was the public declaration that the war's outcome was already decided. Yet, like an army fighting on after its capital has fallen, the hostile powers still resist until the final consummation. Judaism took a different path after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, with no central sanctuary and no Davidic king. The focus of the covenant community shifted to Torah observance, synagogue worship, and rabbinic teaching. The war of the deities was reinterpreted as a moral and spiritual contest between loyalty to the God of Israel and the seductive pull of assimilation into the cultures of the surrounding empires. The rabbis remembered the idolatry of Israel's past not merely as an unfortunate chapter in history, but as an ever-present temptation in new forms, whether the allure of Hellenistic philosophy, Roman political power, or later, the enticements of wealth and prestige under Islamic or Christian rule. In their telling, the battlefield had moved from the public square to the inner life of each Jew, where every choice was either a victory for God's reign or a concession to the idols. By the medieval period, the war motif had become deeply embedded in the religious consciousness of both Jews and Christians. In Jewish mysticism, it was reframed as a cosmic repair project, Tikkun Olam, where the righteous play an active role in restoring divine harmony disrupted by evil. In Christianity, it often took on a militant edge, inspiring crusades and missionary efforts framed as campaigns to liberate lands and peoples from the dominion of false gods. While such movements were frequently entangled with political ambition, they were justified in theological terms that would have been familiar to the prophets of Israel. The God of heaven demands exclusive worship, and his people must oppose all rivals. In the modern age, the old gods of the nations no longer appear in state-sponsored temples, but the pattern of allegiance and rivalry remains. Many theologians and cultural critics have pointed out that nationalism, consumerism, and ideology can function like ancient deities, demanding ultimate loyalty and promising salvation, whether in the form of security, prosperity, or a utopian future. Walter Wink's influential Powers trilogy argued that these systems have both an outer form, institutions, laws, economics, and an inner spirit, values, loyalties, fears, and that the Church's mission is to unmask and confront them. From this perspective, the ancient war of the deities is not a relic of a mythological worldview. It is a description of how power works in every age, even outside religious belief. The structure of the story persists. In popular culture, the motif of one righteous force standing against a coalition of corrupt powers appears in everything from fantasy epics to political dramas. Whether it is a lone hero defying an evil empire, a rebel alliance fighting an oppressive galactic order, or a small community resisting a vast corporate machine, the underlying narrative is the same. There is one rightful authority, and there are pretenders to the throne. The echoes of Yahweh's ancient struggle with Baal and Marduk can be heard in these secular myths, stripped of their theological content, but still charged with the archetypal energy of good versus evil. The persistence of this imagery across centuries suggests that the war of the deities speaks to something fundamental in the human imagination. It addresses the questions: who is ultimately in charge? Whose rules will we follow? Which promises will we trust? For the ancient Israelites, these were not abstract philosophical puzzles. They were the daily realities of life in a world where every nation had its god, and every god had its cult, its demands, and its political reach. To claim that Yahweh was not just Israel's patron, but the one true God, was to challenge the entire structure of ancient religion and politics. It was an act of theological rebellion, a declaration of independence from the spiritual status quo. That same claim, carried forward into later Judaism and Christianity, continues to challenge. It demands that no other authority, whether spiritual, political, cultural, or personal, be allowed to take the place of the God who revealed himself to Moses, spoke through the prophets, and, in Christian belief, entered history in the person of Jesus. It insists that loyalty to this God will inevitably put his people at odds with the prevailing powers, just as it did in the days of Pharaoh, Nebuchadnezzar, and Caesar. In the end, the war of the deities is not just about ancient idols toppled in dusty temples. It is about the ongoing contest for the heart, mind, and allegiance of humanity. The names and faces of the rivals may change, but the demand of the God of Israel remains. You shall have no other gods before me. This is both a warning and a promise. It warns that every rival power, whether as old as Baal or as modern as the cult of self, will eventually be judged and found wanting. And it promises that the God who defeated the gods of the nations will not lose his grip on the world he created. From the thunder over Mount Sinai to the visions of a new heaven and a new earth, the Bible frames history as the stage of this great conflict. In its final act, as the book of Revelation portrays it, all rival powers are overthrown, and the kingdoms of this world become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Messiah. In that moment, the war of the deities, which began in the deserts of the ancient Near East, will end not with a fragile peace between competing powers, but with the unchallenged reign of the one who was, who is, and who is to come. Until then, the choice remains for every generation to live under the reign of the one true God, or to give allegiance whether knowingly or not to the powers that would take his place. The war continues, not on the blood-soaked plains of Megiddo or the high places of Canaan, but in the choices, convictions, and loyalties of ordinary lives. And as long as that choice remains, the war of the deities will never be only a story from the past. It will be the defining struggle of the present. The names of Baal, Chemosh, and Marduk have faded into the ruins of history, but the war they fought is not over. The battlefield has shifted from the high places of Canaan to the unseen realms of culture, politics, and the human heart. The question that began in the deserts of the ancient Near East still stands before every one of us. Who will you serve? For the God who once shattered the idols of the nations still calls for exclusive allegiance.